How does the 5080 compare to the 4080 and the 3080 in Star Citizen? There are two sides to this story. On one hand, as you've probably seen from all the mainstream reviews, the 5080 is not much of an upgrade from the 4080. It's a pretty boring generational improvement. But on the other hand, this is a hot take, I actually think that this is probably the best GPU that you can buy right now for Star Citizen if you're playing at 4K. We'll explain why in a minute. We need to take a look at overclocking. We need to talk about the impact of DLSS on all of this, and I'll also cover why I just don't think the 5090 really makes any sense for Star Citizen specifically. Let's get going. The test setup is in the description. The key thing to call out from this one is that I'm using a motherboard that only supports PCIe Gen 4 for the GPU. So if you've been following the channel for a while, you might remember that when I first built an AM5 system, I went for an all singing, all dancing X670 motherboard from Asus, which just failed within a couple of months. So I just picked up a relatively cheap B650 board from Gigabyte. There's no real performance difference between them until now. As others have shown, the 5000 series cards, which do support PCIe Gen 5, are around 1 to 3% slower when using PCIe Gen 4. So it's not something I think most people will notice, but keep that in mind as you're looking at the 5080 results. It's worth saying that this testing was unbelievably slow and painful. The state of Star Citizen right now is, it's not great. Loading into the game can take so long, and so the runs that I've done here, I've still done them all. I still went absolutely crazy, but it took absolutely ages, and we've got less areas in the game that I've tested. But starting in Lawville at 1080p, what's interesting, first of all, is that we're kind of CPU, memory bandwidth, engine bottlenecked, whatever you want to say here. Performance seems to be up in this latest patch. The entity count seems to be under control. CIG have this thing where some patches, the entity count in Lawville is around the kind of 110,000 mark. Sometimes it shoots right up to 150,000, then they clean things up. And this, as we're saying, a year of performance for Star Citizen, they're doing optimizations and stuff. It seems as though things are getting better, but we're not learning anything from the GPUs here. The 3080 still is an absolute beast at 1080p. Moving on to 1440p, you can see, yes, now the 3080 has slightly fallen behind. Still very playable, I would say, but the other two really are neck and neck. But what we're really here for, these two cards, the 4080 and 5080, are really for 4K, and you can see here, it's not a massive improvement from the 5080 versus the 4080. Like you've seen in other reviews, the uplift just isn't that large. But what might be more interesting is that if you got to 3080, yes, the 5080 is a decent upgrade. It's, yeah, significant. The whole thing, though, that we have to consider when we're talking about these cards is the impact of DLSS. It is pretty amazing how good this new model is. So I've put out a video looking at this new transformer model. It's significantly better than the old CNN model, and it does allow you to do some things in Star Citizen that we'll talk about maybe in a minute with the clouds that are pretty impressive. You have to factor it in because the image quality, I think, is, on the whole, there are trade-offs, but I would say I would personally, if you've got an RTX card, I would be putting DLSS on. And that does change the story when it comes to the performance. You can see here that you can take a 3080 at 4K once you've popped on the performance preset, which upscales from 1080p. You can take that from 35 FPS to a very playable 65 FPS, and you wouldn't really be complaining about that. The only issue really with the 3080, this one at least, this Found Edition one, is that this is the 10GB model, and that is pretty much on the edge for 4K in Star Citizen at this point. But you can also see that really with the 4080, whack on preset K quality, upscaling from 1440p, and you're really close to maxing out the CPU here. So again, you look at this and you think, well, if you've got a 4080, there's just no reason to upgrade to the 5080. It's just, well, it's not really a side grade, but it's just a tiny incremental improvement. Let's move on to quantum travel. Here we are at 1080p, and you can see that the newer cards are obviously ahead, but the 3080 completely playable. Again, still very good at 1080p. At 1440p, again, 3080 still playable, and this, we haven't included any upscaling here. You can totally turn on DLSS and get even more frames, but you don't really need to. At 4K, again, you're seeing the same sort of increase between the 4080 and the 5080. It's nothing impressive. And again, once we turn on DLSS, you can see that, yeah, you can take a 3080 from being not particularly playable at 4K to being 60 FPS. And you can also basically take the 4080 and 5080 a bit further than they were. I mean, again, you can see the difference between the two cards. It's not significant. And one of the things that I did find when I tested this, NVIDIA kind of claimed that this new transformer model, this new AI way of doing their upscaling for this preset K is heavier on older RTX cards, but it just doesn't seem to be at all. There seems to be similar hit to performance by using this new transformer model. So again, if you've got a 4080, there's just no reason to upgrade to the 5080. Let's get into the clouds. This is a fun place to test. First of all, 4K at medium with the clouds, and you can see that, yeah, 3080 is a bit behind, but again, you could use upscaling here, but really the medium clouds don't look great even at 4K. But now you can do the fun stuff. 1080p with the photo mode clouds, as heavy as you can get. You can see that the 5080 and 4080, this is about the only reason why you possibly want to play with these cards at 1080p. If you've got a 1080p monitor, on the whole, you definitely shouldn't be buying either of these graphics cards, unless for some reason you really want the clouds to look as good as possible, because at 1080p you can get fairly decent performance out of the 5080 and the 4080. At 1440p, as you'd expect, that would drop. And at 4K, they are really struggling. I mean, when I tested the 4080 initially versus the 7900 XTX, we saw that the 7900 XTX was a bit in front. The 5080 hasn't really changed much. But the key again, going back to it, the savior of NVIDIA cards at this point is DLSS. And you can see that you can, by using the performance preset, you can take the 5080 to 60 FPS. So probably what you'd actually recommend, although I haven't tested it here, is maybe the very high clouds, which aren't quite as punishing, but you can get decent frame rates. If you were wanting to take some nice smooth videos or whatever, you could, in theory, whack on the performance preset, upscale from 1080p, and because this new transform model is so good, upscaling from 1080p still basically looks as good as upscaling from 4040p. But where does that leave the 5080? Well, from all of this so far, it is very disappointing, as you've seen in other reviews. But as I said, there is kind of another argument to all of this. And let's first of all talk about the overclocking. I spent a bit of time using the Steel Nomad run to do some overclocking. There's been some noise over the internet the last kind of week or so about overclocking these cards. And I found that you could push my 5080 at least pretty hard. 500 megahertz extra on the core clock. And although people are going to scream error correction stuff to me, the fastest I could get this running that wasn't actually still losing performance was plus 1200 on the memory. So again, I did lots of testing this up and down. That was the fastest kind of sweet spot I could find. And in Star Citizen, what does that equate to? Well, it's actually not bad. So it's a pretty decent increase. Now, if this was what these cars were performing out the box, I think all the reviews would have been very different. I think they would have said, yeah, it's pretty decent. I think it's because they haven't pushed it, and obviously potentially I've got a good card that will allow me to overclock more, but there seems to be fairly consistent success with overclocking across the board from all the things that I've seen on the internet. Have NVIDIA deliberately nerfed this card to make the 5090 look more appealing? That's my real question. Have they deliberately just kept down the core clock and not pushed it as far as they could, just so that the reviews were bad? Have they deliberately made the 5080 bad so that they pushed kind of high-end users towards 5090? I mean, maybe that sounds a bit crazy, but it genuinely, once you've overclocked it, it looks pretty impressive. Now, for this channel, for most videos, I'll leave everything stock so you can see what performance would be like if, at the worst case scenario. But yeah, there is performance that if you're into overclocking, it's not hard to do, and you could definitely improve performance. So let me get onto the actual claim here that this is the best card that you could buy for 4K Star Citizen gaming. Now, there's lots of caveats here. This is a hot take. I'm now turning on my NVIDIA marketing hat. If you wanted to make an argument for this card, you could argue that buying a 5090, which is obviously much more powerful and does on paper look much more impressive, is a bit of a waste in Star Citizen because you're so often bottlenecked by, like we say, the CPU / memory bandwidth / the engine. I think the 5090, you definitely wouldn't be getting double the performance with the 5090. It's double the cost, 1,000 to 2,000. You definitely wouldn't be seeing double the performance. And there are other use cases for that card. And if Star Citizen isn't the main game that you're thinking about, then yes, there are cases. But for Star Citizen specifically, I just think the 5090, and I always said this kind of about the 4090 as well, they don't make complete sense at the price they are. The 4090 still is probably a more appealing card in some ways, but the price is still, I'm looking on eBay for second-hand ones, you're still going to be paying way more than you would for a new 5080. So again, I'm playing a bit devil's advocate here, but there is an argument to say that the 5080 makes more sense, definitely from a financial point of view, than either the 4090 or the 5090. I paid MSRP for this, $970 in the UK. Don't buy one for more money than MSRP. It is not worth it in that case. Then we must consider AMD's offerings in this sort of price range, and really we're only talking about the 7900 XTX. And like I said, when I first looked at that, I actually last generation bought that first and was planning to keep that card, but then there was all the hotspot issues with it, and so I ended up then returning that, getting a 4080 and then testing them against each other. So it is kind of trading blows with the 4080 and therefore the 5080 as well. It's a decent option, but you do unfortunately really have to consider the impact of DLSS, because it is significant. The picture quality difference, the image that you're looking at on your screen is significantly better with DLSS than FSR or CRG's own TSI. It's just night and day, and there is no, you just can't argue against that. It makes a significant difference to the image quality. So that's one kind of mark against the AMD kind of top-end card at the moment. The other thing would be ray trace global illumination. We've not had much of an update. We had a bit of CitizenCon. We know it's coming. Probably it's going to come with Squadron 42. I can't see CRG releasing that game without ray tracing. There's just no way. And so the reality is AMD are just miles behind NVIDIA when it comes to ray tracing. You might be sitting there thinking, I don't care. I just don't care. And I think that's fair enough. Some people just don't care about ray tracing. The thing is that there are now, we're getting to the point where there are games that just come with it on by default. You can't turn it off. And so I don't think that will be Star Citizen's approach. I don't think CRG will go that way. Who knows? But in reality, it is, again, another mark against the AMD top-end card, because they're just miles off it in terms of ray tracing performance. Essentially, that could change when it comes to the new 9070 XT that AMD are releasing. That won't be a top-end card. It won't really replace the 7900 XTX in terms of raster performance, but we're hoping for a jump forward in FSR. FSR4 is coming, and we're also hoping for better ray tracing performance. So I am planning to pick one of those up. That won't probably have FSR4 support in Star Citizen out of the box, but it's still probably worth testing. But if I am an NVIDIA shill, which I'm not, I would be saying that if you look at all the options on the market now, assuming you can buy a 5080 at the right price, if you were to buy one today and you weren't to worry too much about future VRAM considerations, because 16 gigabytes is not quite, it's not ideal. But for now, it seems to be fine, especially in Star Citizen. There's no real risk of running out of VRAM. If you were to look at all the options, I think there is an argument to say that the 5080 actually is the one for Star Citizen at 4K. The other argument is that a used 4080 would basically get you pretty much the same performance. You wouldn't really notice, especially once you put DLSS on. So, I don't know. Ultimately, it's a disappointing GPU, but there is a use case for it. This one is over.